I'm Indy Neidell, and this is Out of the Foxholes, where I sit vaguely near my chair of infinite knowledge and answer your questions about World War II. Remember, Time Ghost Army members get prioritized or even guaranteed answers. And our first question comes from a new brigadier, which is the highest rank in the Time Ghost Army. And that rank comes with a bunch of benefits, which I'll tell you about at the end of the video. Okay, so Brigadier Canadian in Michigan asks, the Battle of the Atlantic is seen as principally a British, American, and to a lesser extent Canadian endeavor. However, the merchantmen and the convoys flew the flags of many countries. Can you talk to the question of how these diverse fleets were managed as part of the task of keeping the UK fed and supplied? Also, were any of the Liberty ships given to the fleets of these other countries? I'm particularly interested in the Polish merchant marine and whether their losses were replaced by allies. I have not been able to find any data on that. By this point in the war, the British merchant navy has integrated huge chunks of the European merchant shipping fleets into its strength, so much so that about a third of it is made up of foreign ships. The first were 38 Polish vessels that escaped the threat of German invasion in August 1939. But the biggest influx came after the German invasions in Scandinavia and Western Europe in the spring and summer of 1940. The Germans seized every ship they could, but over 70% of the Norwegian, Belgian, and Dutch merchant fleets were out at sea or in foreign ports. Both sides made broadcasts trying to win them over, but the British had the governments in exile on their side, so almost all of the ships came to Britain or put into neutral ports. The Belgian government in exile handed over all of their small fleets straight away. The Norwegians and the Dutch handed over about half of their fleets, about 400,000 and about 1 million tons, right? For them, shipping was still an important source of income. Greek and Yugoslavian ships also joined the merchant navy later on. And these allied ships continue flying their own flag and paying their crews the same rates they would have received in their home countries, which is quite a bit higher than their British counterparts. The catch is that London has final authority on how these ships are used, although they do, of course, consult with the relevant governments in exile. Things are a bit different for Danish and French ships and sailors. Some Danish ships have come over to the British side too, but others have continued working for their Danish shipping companies as before. About 500,000 tons of French shipping found refuge in Britain and the Commonwealth after the armistice, but many of the seamen demanded to be repatriated to Vichy France. The British let the men go, but kept their ships. The French and Danish ships and seamen who stayed with the Allies have been transferred to being under the British flag because the British thought that authorities from Vichy France, occupied Denmark, or Germany might seize any ships flying the French or Danish flags in neutral ports. So French and Danish sailors sail under the British flag and have to put up with the lower British pay rate. The Danes are fond of saying they are allies in all but name and pay, which is pretty funny, actually. Well, as for non-American operators of Liberty ships, the Americans lend 178 Liberty ships to the British. The ships the Americans send all have names beginning with Sam, right? Some are pretty normal, or normal-ish, like Samfire, but others are really weird, like Samafric or Sambank. The Americans lend 37 to the Soviet Union, 6 to the Belgians, and 2 to the Chinese. Small spoiler alert, but after the war, 836 surviving Liberty ships will be sold to countries rebuilding their fleets. Greek companies will alone take 526 and Italy 98. When it comes to the Poles, the British do transfer British and French warships to make good on their losses, but it doesn't look like they replace merchant losses. But as you say, though, there is almost no information readily available on this. The next question comes from Time Ghost Army Specialist General Blood Diamond, but shortened into a YouTube kind of name. Right. Okay. One of the lesser known areas of the conflict was Africa, or rather everywhere from Sudan to Kenya, all the way down to South Africa. Besides the British taking Ethiopia, what was African opinion about the war? How were British colonies governed? And what major events occurred in the Middle Eastern African fronts? Okay, that's a really big question, so I'll just tackle part of it, right? What was happening in sub-Saharan Africa during the Second War? Well, you asked about British colonies, so let's take a look at them. Okay, well, South Africa is technically a dominion rather than a colony. Here, the white population that runs the country is divided between English-speaking descendants of British settlers and Afrikaans-speaking descendants of Dutch settlers. Generally speaking, the English speakers are fully behind the war and speak in terms of king, country, and empire. Afrikaner opinion is more divided. Many have little love for the British, especially since they crushed Afrikaner autonomy in the Second Boer War. But more liberal Afrikaners believe fighting alongside the British is the right thing to do. Chief among these is an old colleague of ours from the Great War, South African Prime Minister and good friend of Winston Churchill, Field Marshal Jan Smuts. There are still big players in South African politics who believe that the country should have stayed neutral, though, like former Prime Minister JBM Hertzog and his old allies in the cabinet. There's even actually a small Nazi-inspired Afrikaner fascist group called Ossewa Brandwag, known by its initials OB. This group has tried to sabotage the war effort. They've destroyed power lines, railways, they've cut telegraph and phone lines. So the government has placed thousands of them in internment camps, but these guys are really only a fringe group. About 211,000 white South Africans volunteer for service. The director of military intelligence, Ernst Gideon Malherbe, sums up the view of many Afrikaners. Our fathers were fighting for their freedom against British imperialism. Now we are fighting against a worse imperialism, namely Hitler's. History is the story of one man's eternal struggle for freedom. Black, Indian, and non-white South Africans are not allowed into combat roles, but over 120,000 serve as medics, porters, and guards. Things are different in the colonies run directly by Britain. 600,000 men from across Africa serve on front lines around the world in regiments like the King's African Rifles, the Nigerian Regiment, the Gold Coast Regiment. I've covered some of these units already in the regular episodes, like when the Nigerian Brigade pulled off the fastest military pursuit in history and advanced 930 kilometers into Italian Somaliland in under 10 days, and nearly 2,000 total in that short campaign. African volunteers have the same opinions and motivations as volunteer soldiers the world over. They want to earn money, see the world, learn new skills, defend their homes. As one Kenyan soldier recalls, we had been told that unless we joined up and helped the government, Kenya would be occupied by Germans and Italians. To keep out these monsters and also to escape the boredom and difficulty of being unemployed in Nairobi, I enlisted. But not all are volunteers. Schools, employers, and the local government strong-arm men into serving. Sometimes the British go even further and enlist local chiefs to conscript men forcibly. Few records from black African soldiers will survive the war, but from those that do, and from the words of white soldiers and administrators, it is clear that fighting brings a new perspective on the empire. Chief among their complaints is the lower pay compared with white and Asian soldiers, being subjected to corporal punishment, including flogging, and the absurdity of fighting in a war for freedom while under imperial rule. See, black soldiers also come into contact with Indian soldiers, many of whom are firmly behind Indian self-rule. My final question today comes from Time Ghost Army member Juraj Knapec of the 1943-44 division. Okay? He asks, what is the internal situation of Slovakia and Hungary since the war began till now? So, where they're relevant, I've mentioned Slovakia and Hungary in the weekly episodes, and so is Spartacus, War Against Humanity. But like other small Axis countries, they tend to fly under the radar a bit, although, spoiler, that might well soon change here in 1944. But let's take a closer look at them today. Slovakia is a German client state under President Josef Tiso, a Catholic priest of the cleric fascist Slovak People's Party. Tiso has sent 45,000 soldiers to the Eastern Front. He's also deported some 58,000 Slovakian Jews, some to concentration camps, but most to extermination factories in occupied Poland. But there is some opposition to Tiso brewing. Slovak soldiers, they've taken heavy losses. And as the Red Army continues to push westward, Slovakian opinion is turning against the war. Italy leaving the war inspired a range of political opponents from communists, social democrats, nationalists, and army officers to form the Slovak National Council at the end of last year. They have contacts with the British, the Czechoslovak government in exile, and small groups of Slovak partisans who've been carrying out acts of sabotage. The National Council wants an end to the alignment with Nazi Germany, the re-establishment of Czechoslovakia, and the restoration of democracy under exiled Prime Minister Beneš. But they know the Germans will never allow this. In March, the council will begin discussing options for an uprising. So you should definitely keep watching the War Against Humanity series because Sparty very much will cover whatever comes of these options, okay? Keep an eye out for that. Across the border in Hungary, Miklos Horthy is also looking for a way out of the war. Oh, quick sidetrack here. Horthy might have the strangest set of titles of any leader in the war because he's a regent in charge of a kingdom without a king and an admiral without a fleet or a sea. Anyway, joining the German invasion of the Soviet Union has been bad for Hungary by now. Its premier fighting force, the Second Army, was wiped out in January 1943 when the Soviets counterattacked around Stalingrad. Just 40,000 of its 200,000 men returned home. Later in the year, Horthy sent representatives for discussions with the Allies in Turkey, but these went nowhere for two main reasons. First, the Hungarians continued supporting German policy, like recognizing Mussolini's Italian Social Republic in September 1943. Second, in exchange for leaving the war, Horthy wanted Anglo-American troops to protect his country from vengeful Germans and advancing Soviets. That possibility has vanished since the Allies invaded Italy and planned to invade France over a Balkan invasion. Berlin knows about these negotiations from pro-German members of Horthy's government. They are understandably a bit unhappy. They're also frustrated by Hungary's relatively lenient treatment of its 800,000 Jews. The Hungarians did deport about 18,000 of them in summer of 1941, and they've killed Jews in Yugoslavia and in the East, but although Hungarian Jews are discriminated against, put in ghettos, forced into labor battalions, the vast majority of them are still alive. And other Jews from across occupied Europe have found refuge in Hungary. By now, after a series of bad-tempered meetings, Hitler and Horthy pretty much despise each other. Soon, right, peering into the future, Horthy will tell Hitler that he wants to bring all Hungarian troops still on the Eastern Front back home. Ooh, well, we'll have to see how the Fuhrer reacts. I think he might be a little pissed off. I mean, I don't know him that well or anything, just talking about him week after week for the last bunch of years. Okay. Well, that concludes this latest installment of Out of the Foxholes, right? If you want to learn more about what life might have been on one of those multinational merchant ships, you can click here for a special we did on that. Spoiler alert, pretty much sucked. And, as I said at the beginning, about being a Time Ghost Brigadier, it means your name is credited on our episode's end screen. It gives you access to a private WhatsApp group with all of us, me and Sparty and Astrid and Ian and everybody included. And after 12 months, it means you can choose to dedicate an episode to someone who experienced World War II in the form of a video memorial. It also means you get a guaranteed answer to your Out of the Foxholes question, as do all members ranking from captain. But, like Miklos Horthy, I have something to tell you, which you may be a little pissed off about. No, I am not withdrawing my troops from the Eastern Front, far from it. But if you leave your questions in the comments section, I will not read them. I love reading your questions, but I will not read them. So please, only send them in through Patreon or at community community.timeghost.tv. That's community.timeghost.tv. See you next time.